April 14th, 1945, Ruhr Valley, Western Germany. The rain had passed in the final hours before dawn, but the ground still held its memory. Mud gripped every boot with a dead weight, as if the earth itself had become unwilling to let men move any farther. The factories stood like hollow ribs against a sky of wet ash. Broken glass glittered faintly in puddles. Somewhere beyond the railway embankment, American artillery rolled across the darkness in slow, deliberate pulses, not wild or uncertain, but measured, disciplined, almost mechanical in its confidence. The war no longer sounded like a clash of armies. It sounded like a machine completing its work. In the yard of a ruined farm, near a road choked with abandoned wagons, retreating vehicles, and men too exhausted to speak, several German officers came upon the remains of a captured American supply point. Crates had burst open in the rain. Cardboard cartons sagged in the mud. Metal tins gleamed under straw and splintered wood. There were packets of coffee still dry inside waxed wrapping, candy sealed against the weather, cigarettes bundled in accessory packs, and a crate of dehydrated eggs marked in clean, efficient lettering. Near it lay a small square of wrapped chocolate, unremarkable by the standards of the army that had issued it, almost unbelievable by the standards of the army that now stared at it. In that pale hour, amid collapse, exhaustion, and the smell of burnt oil, that little square of sweetness was no mere ration. It was a verdict. This is how many wars truly end. Not first in capitals, nor in communiques, nor in the formal language of surrender, but in the private recognition of men who finally understand what they are facing. By the spring of 1945, German officers in the West were not simply losing ground. They were confronting a kind of power that the ideology of the Reich had never fully understood. For years, they had believed that war was won by hardness, sacrifice, endurance, and the spiritual superiority of a disciplined people. They had been taught that America was rich but soft, productive but unserious, a nation of comfort, commerce, and appetite that could not possibly match the iron will of a continental empire. Yet now, the opposite truth stood before them in rain-soaked wrapping paper and intact ration tins. The Americans were not weak because they had abundance, or they were powerful because they had learned how to organize abundance. In the American system, factories, farms, laboratories, railroads, shipping fleets, quartermaster depots, and field kitchens all served the same purpose. They did not merely support the war, they became part of the war. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States procured roughly 1 billion special rations, costing about $675 million, while more than 105 million K-rations were procured in 1944 alone. Those numbers do not merely describe food. They describe a society able to feed movement itself. What the German officers expected from war and what they found had become two different worlds. They had expected exhaustion to prove virtue. They had expected hunger to purify nations. They had expected democracies to become hesitant, divided, and weak under strain. They had expected abundance to rot discipline. Instead, they found American troops crossing France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany with hot coffee, canned meat, sugar, cigarettes, candy, chocolate, gum, and even eggs, sometimes canned, sometimes powdered, always systematized. In American rations, there were C rations with meat units, biscuits, cereal, sugar, and coffee. K rations compact enough for assault troops with biscuits, meat or cheese components, fruit bars, chocolate, bouillon, and soluble coffee. D rations of concentrated chocolate, and accessory packets that included cigarettes. Even the plain technical efficiency of dehydrated eggs told a story. Perishability conquered by industry, fragility converted into transport, breakfast itself made strategic. The shock of such things cannot be understood only in culinary terms. A hungry man does not envy food merely because it tastes good. He envies the world that made it ordinary. That was what made American candy so disturbing and American eggs so revealing. A wrapped chocolate square in a German hand was not simply sugar, fat, and cocoa. It represented stable shipping, abundant agriculture, packaging science, labor coordination, mass production, and the confidence of a nation that could send its soldiers small comforts while advancing through a collapsing continent. The eggs were no less symbolic. They were humble, powdered, even inelegant, yet someone had gathered them, processed them, preserved them, packed them, shipped them, guarded them, and delivered them into a war zone thousands of miles from the farms that produced them. What German officers saw in those crates was not luxury. Luxury might have been easier to dismiss. They saw routine. And routine is the most terrifying form of superiority. By early 1945, the German war machine had lost the ability to disguise its own decay. Fuel shortages, ammunition shortages, breakdowns in transport, shattered rail networks, ruined cities, and the increasingly desperate use of boys and old men all exposed a truth that propaganda could no longer conceal. Yet propaganda had done its work too well to disappear overnight. Many officers still clung to old assumptions. They could still tell themselves that German soldiers were more serious, more seasoned, more willing to endure. They could still believe, at least for a few more weeks, that suffering itself granted dignity and perhaps even military value. But battle after battle was teaching a harsher lesson. Suffering by itself, Oz did not win wars. It simply consumed those who mistook it for strategy. When German formations met American power in 1944 and 1945, they met not only fire, but replenishment, not only courage, but continuity. In the West, this truth became impossible to ignore during the final great operations beyond the Rhine. On March 7, 1945, American forces reached Remagen and captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact, a stroke of fortune that became a door into Germany. On March 23rd, Operation Plunder began with a huge artillery preparation and airborne assault. On March 25th, the attack from the Remagen bridgehead pushed forward before dawn. American armored columns found seams, widened them, and kept moving. The campaign unfolded with a speed that left German headquarters confused, displaced, and increasingly irrelevant. By April 1st, even the pincers closed at Lippstadt, trapping Army Group B in what became the Ruhr Pocket. Inside were 7 corps, 19 divisions, 26 generals, and eventually 317,000 prisoners. Historians later described the Ruhr as the moment when the German army died in the West. That phrase was not rhetorical. It marked the destruction not simply of formations, but of the remaining illusion that Germany could still shape events. The war in the West had ceased to be a contest between alternatives. It had become the administration of an ending. American historians and battlefield accounts alike emphasized 2 features that shattered German resistance in these last weeks: speed and firepower. If an American unit found a gap, it could move through it like lightning. If it met resistance, it could call down such quantities of artillery that German soldiers remained stunned by the scale. In one portion of the Ruhr fighting, American artillery units fired 259,000 rounds in 14 days. Estimates for the wider battle suggest close to 1 million shells in 2 weeks. German commanders found their communications fraying, their headquarters uprooted, their counter orders irrelevant before they could even be relayed. The blistering pace of the American advance forced command posts to flee or vanish into confusion. This was war fought not as isolated heroism, but as a synchronized system. The same society that could produce shells in such numbers could also keep coffee hot at the front and chocolate dry in the rain. The same army that could encircle 317,000 men could also distribute candy as part of standard field provisioning. That was not indulgence. It was civilization weaponized. And in that lies the emotional rupture at the center of this story. German officers had been raised, trained, and promoted within a culture that believed discipline was born of deprivation. American discipline, by contrast, emerged from something they had mocked: organization within abundance. They expected softness and found resilience. They expected comfort to breed cowardice and found comfort integrated into combat efficiency. They expected that men with cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, and easy calories would crack under pressure. Instead, those men drove farther, fired longer, crossed rivers faster, and replaced losses more smoothly than the starved idealists of the Reich. The old hierarchy collapsed in a ration box. One must be careful here. This was not a fairy tale in which American soldiers floated through Europe untouched by fear, grief, mud, loss, or complaint. They suffered terribly, bled heavily, and often disliked the very rations that so impressed their enemies. K rations in particular could become tiresome and morale neutral over long use, and many GIs grumbled about repetition, quality, and monotony. But even that complaint reveals the deeper truth. American soldiers could complain about rations because the system existed so reliably. Their dissatisfaction occurred within abundance. German soldiers, by contrast, had increasingly moved beyond complaint into simple absence. When one side debates the quality of its food, While the other doubts the arrival of food at all, the war has already entered a different category. The symbolic power of eggs in this story deserves special attention. Eggs are among the simplest images of ordinary peace. They belong to farms, kitchens, breakfasts, and households more than to empires. Yet the 20th century turned even such simplicity into industrial calculation. During World War II, the United States dehydrated vast quantities of eggs. Roughly 1/4 of American egg production was converted into powder and shipped to allied nations such as Britain, China, and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. Powdered eggs were not glamorous. They were practical, space-saving, durable, and often disliked. But in war, practicality can itself become grandeur. Powdered eggs occupied only a fraction of the shipping space of shelled eggs. They transformed a fragile food into a portable reserve of protein. In Europe, that's where scarcity and rationing defined daily life. The existence of such a system was astonishing. To find eggs in German hands in 1945 was one thing. To find American eggs in quantity, standardized and field-ready, was another. It suggested not merely supply, but surplus, not merely improvisation, but foresight. The candy, however, carried a different and perhaps deeper meaning. Chocolate in wartime Europe was not just food. It was memory. It was childhood before bombing. It was bakery windows before blackout regulations. It was the vanished private world that total war had consumed. The U.S. Army understood, whether consciously or instinctively, that morale was not sustained by calories alone. Candy, gum, cigarettes, chocolate, coffee. These linked the front line to normality, to home, to a larger civilian abundance still intact across the Atlantic. Children in occupied and liberated Europe understood this immediately. So did prisoners. So did defeated enemies. A small square of American chocolate did not merely say that America could feed its army. It said that America could preserve a piece of ordinary life inside mechanized slaughter. That was a profoundly unsettling thing for the servants of a regime that had made permanent emergency into a political religion. The transformation of German perception can be traced in personal memory as clearly as in operational history. One former German POW, Günter Graeve, captured in Normandy in 1944, later remembered his time in American captivity with astonishment rather than hatred. All we cared about was the food, he said. In a later recollection, or he remembered standing in front of a shop in the POW camp, considering what to buy first with camp pay, an ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola. He chose both. The last ice cream he had bought in Germany had been years before. Coca-Cola he had never had. In that moment, he realized how lucky he was to have been captured by the Americans and not the Soviets. That statement is more than gratitude. It is an ideological collapse in miniature. A young man shaped by Nazi youth culture entered captivity expecting degradation and instead encountered meat, vegetables, paid work, camp shops, and a scale of everyday abundance unknown to him in wartime Germany. American POW policy toward Germans was not born solely of sentiment. U.S. Authorities also understood that treatment of German prisoners could influence the treatment of American prisoners in German hands. Contemporary explanations from camps such as Papago Park noted good meals and respect for prisoners' rights as part of a deliberate logic. There was, as one line put it, a method to this madness. More than 500 POW camps across the United States held over 400,000 prisoners, mostly German. Yet intention does not diminish effect. To the prisoner himself, motive mattered less than reality. He had expected one image of America and found another. Instead of barbarous decadence, he found disciplined plenty. Instead of a caricature, he found a working society. What happened to some German soldiers in captivity happened to German children in the rubble. After the fighting passed, after flags and front lines shifted, and after homes lay broken and schools improvised survival, many German children first encountered Americans through food. Joachim Zinram, remembering his childhood near Bad Kreuznach after the war, described it simply, "We had nothing to eat." He carried an empty lunchbox to school, where American supported aid sometimes filled it with grits, rice pudding, or chocolate milk. It meant the world to us. It helped us survive. Outside school, a slice of bread for a whole day might be all there was. Then came the sound of tanks and jeeps heard before seen, the hum and rumble of American engines moving through town. He would wait by the roadside. Soldiers sometimes stopped and handed out candy, chocolate, and bubble gum. Those things, he said, were like treasures. There is a quiet revolution inside that memory. And the same people who had been taught to fear invasion now heard engines and thought of sweetness. The same children whom Nazi authority had meant to raise inside obedience and sacrifice began associating foreign soldiers with relief. In such moments, ideology does not merely lose a battle, it loses the imagination of the next generation. The Reich had promised greatness and delivered hunger, ruin, and fatherless households. America arrived with armored vehicles and chocolate. That contrast was too intimate to be argued away. In liberated Luxembourg, similar memories were formed. American sea ration cans, corned beef, vegetable hash, potato flakes, spaghetti and meatballs, soluble coffee, dehydrated eggs, chewing gum, and Hershey bars entered village life as astonishing forms of supplementary food. Children cherished the chocolate and gum. Thanksgiving meals with trucks delivering turkeys, cranberry jelly, and field kitchen supplies became spectacles of abundance so unforgettable that they survived in local historical memory. This mattered because food communicated the nature of the occupier or liberator more quickly than speeches ever could. One kind of army requisitioned, another distributed. One kind of power starved the future, another could afford to share. Yet the deepest transformation in this story is not logistical, it is moral. The Nazi worldview rested on a hierarchy of human value enforced through violence, racial exclusion, discipline, and endless mobilization. Its promise was strength through domination. Its actual result was exhaustion without limit. The American democratic world, for all its contradictions, projected something utterly different into ruined Europe by 1945, that mass production could coexist with civilian prosperity, that soldiers could be supplied without stripping every trace of sweetness from life, that an army could fight ferociously and still carry candy in its pockets, that a state could defeat an enemy and then feed his children. To starving civilians and disillusioned prisoners, that difference became tangible long before it became philosophical. That is why the small square of chocolate keeps returning in this story. It begins as an object in the mud. It becomes proof in an officer's hand. It becomes delight in a child's palm. It becomes memory decades later. It is at once military issue, industrial product, and moral symbol. The wrapped chocolate represents American abundance not because it was rare, but because it was common. Democracy at its strongest can make the extraordinary seem ordinary. It can place within reach of common soldiers and common children things that authoritarian systems reserve for slogans, elites, or black markets. Germany's Western War was over, but there was another quieter ending too. It unfolded in minds long conditioned to believe that scarcity made them superior. In that final encounter with American food, many discovered instead that freedom, industry, and abundance could produce a tougher kind of endurance than fear ever had. Even the square of chocolate in the mud said what 1,000 speeches no longer could. The eggs in their crates said what the maps already knew. The war was not lost because Germany lacked courage. It was lost because it had built a system that devoured life faster than it could sustain it, while across the ocean a different system had learned how to feed both armies and hope. Long after the guns fell silent, German children remembered the taste of that hope. Some remembered empty lunchboxes filled at school with American aid. Some remembered roadside candy passed from tanks and jeeps. Some remembered chocolate milk, gum, and the first proof that the men who had conquered them did not intend to starve them. Former prisoners remembered ice cream, Coca-Cola, meat, vegetables, and the baffling kindness of structure where they had expected only captivity. In those memories, sweetness outlived ideology. A dictatorship had marched under banners, drums, and commands. A democracy often announced itself with engines, paper wrapping, and something sweet pressed into a waiting hand. Perhaps that is the larger truth hidden inside this small wartime image. Freedom is not only a speech, a constitution, or a ballot. At its most powerful, it is a system capable of turning harvests into relief, industry into stability. Chocolate is not important because it is luxurious. It is important because it is democratic in its distribution. The eggs complete that symbolism. Chocolate evokes sweetness and desire. Eggs evoke nourishment and continuity. Together they form a strange but powerful pair. Pleasure and sustenance, morale and maintenance, childhood and kitchen, memory and routine. German officers who found American candy and eggs in 1945 were not merely discovering foodstuffs. They were discovering that the enemy they faced could wage total war without surrendering the habits of ordinary life. That realization cut deeper than fear. Fear can still produce defiance. But when an officer begins to understand that the opposing system is richer, calmer, faster, and more durable than his own, defiance thins into fatalism. The war may continue for days or weeks. In his mind, it has already ended. And so, in the final spring of the war in the West, the collapse of Germany was heard not only in artillery, nor seen only in white flags and columns of prisoners. It was felt in smaller recognitions, in the weight of an unopened American ration tin, in the neatness of waxed paper around coffee, in the baffling presence of eggs in a battlefield crate, in the wrapped square of chocolate that survived the rain, in the knowledge that somewhere behind these advancing columns stood farms still producing, factories still filling orders, trains still moving, ports still loading, mothers still sending parcels, and a political system that, for all its noise and freedoms and contradictions, had unleashed a scale of organized plenty that the Reich could neither imitate nor endure. When Army Group B died in the Ruhr, when the pocket broke apart and mass surrenders began, when Field Marshal Model chose death rather than witness the world that remained, the military meaning was obvious: ability and abundance into something shareable. It does not abolish suffering. It does not erase war's cruelty. But it can create a world in which even amid ruin, a child can taste something better than fear, and a defeated enemy can glimpse, however painfully, why the strength of a society that did not have to starve itself to win. In the end, the candy mattered because it was sweet. The eggs mattered because they promised life would continue. And together, in the mud of 1945, they told the exhausted servants of a dying Reich that the future belonged not to the loudest ideology, but to the civilization that could still feed tomorrow.